14. The Secret of the Golden Papaya. It was purely by accident that I discovered the secret of a successful papaya patch. When I brought home my first plump tropical melon, I was confident these were going to be some of my more obliging seeds. The papaya is reputed to be one of the easiest of all tropical plants to grow. Each fruit contains hundreds of seeds. Supposedly they're so impatient to sprout, they have been known to begin sending roots out when the fruit is still ripening. Furthermore, a papaya under good growing conditions reaches the bearing stage as soon as 9 months after it first sprouts. With several fruits on a papaya plant and several hundred seeds in each fruit, I could see a papaya population explosion was imminent. I cleared a large portion of the table by the window. Many papaya desserts later, not only had I not found a papaya with seeds already germinating, but also I had in the papaya patch was all I had in a papaya patch was a couple of empty pots and 3 little see-through containers filled with moist cheesecloths, papaya seeds, and mold. Lots of mold. Susan several times encouraged me to dispose of the display, but I held out stubbornly for my laissez-faire gardening philosophy and let the seeds mold on their merry way. Sure enough, 3 months later, the seeds had sprouted, thanks to the same unpopular mold. A blanket of mold is not really essential to the papaya propagation, but it was a clue to the real secret. I found the explanation of what had happened under the blanket in the fine print of a footnote on page 592 of Tropical and Subtropical Agriculture by Ochs, Sol, Dijkman, and Welberg. The aerial around each seed must be removed before it can be planted or dried for storage. So that was it. Papaya seeds come wrapped in their own little natural baggies like pomegranate seeds. However, unlike pomegranate aerials, which one eats, papaya aerials, almost invisible, go unnoticed by the gourmet. As the papaya seed dries, the thin jello-like coating dries with it, protecting the seed from moisture and effectively preventing germination. In the case of my seeds, apparently the mold had managed after 3 months to undermine this shell, letting moisture in and activating the germination process. The same footnote explained that the usual method of removing the aerial is to rub a number of seeds together on a fine meshed screen under running water. After they have been thoroughly dried, seeds will remain viable for several years if put into airtight containers. Privately, I thought this the long way round the papaya bush, since the seeds came packed in their own airtight containers to begin with. I suppose the aerial keeps a seed from germinating until the season with conditions most suitable for seedlings rolls around again. And I will concede that without the inhibitions of their aerials, papayas might overrun somebody's country or other. But I was thankful to be so unexpectedly rid of mine. This hurdle over, presumably I'd have no more problems with papaya plants. You will recall that Though as big as a full-grown tree and somewhat like a palm in build, the papaya is neither but an arborescent herb. This ought to mean it looks like a tree and grows like an herb that is withers to the ground each year. But the papaya doesn't wither to the ground, it just keeps growing and bearing for years on end. So it doesn't fit the dictionary definition of an herb either. I've given up and now I refer to it simply as a plant. That should be safe enough. One warning to potential papaya growers I should note here. The papaya plant is probably the most sensitive of all tropical fruit bearers to standing water and poor aeration. For this reason, the standard porous terracotta pot is a must for them. Likewise, the drainage hole must be covered with larger than normal stoppers, preferably pieces of broken pottery 2 inches or so across. The papaya's sensitive roots will die off after as short a time as 48 hours in standing water. I've found a loose soil mixture, half humus, half potting soil with a good handful of vermiculite best prevents caking and throttling of the delicate roots. Their frailty also makes the papaya seedlings somewhat wary of transplanting, so I've taken to planting the seeds in pots larger than I would normally use for seedlings, 8 inches or more in diameter. With my new footnote instructions on undressing papaya seeds, I set to work on a fresh dessert-destined melon. I spooned a heap of the moist, somewhat messy seeds onto a newspaper. Experimentation soon showed that you don't really have to scrub the seeds against the screen to remove the areoles. Squeezing them slightly off-center made the seed pop out of the areole. The technique is similar to the children's practice of squeezing watermelon seeds between the fingers, so shoot them at unsuspecting targets. In fact, it's a little too similar. Demonstrating the process to Susan, I turned to get another piece of paper on which to rest the de-aeroled seeds. There was a soft splat on the back of my neck, then another. A third seed sailed narrowly past my ear. Paying no attention, since Susan was putting on the wide-eyed innocent act, I returned to the table and selected the juiciest seeds I could find. An hour later, picking up stray papaya seeds from the 4 corners of the room, I had a respectable pile of the little black wrinkled balls lying in a warm spot to dry. The next day, I placed a dozen seeds on the soil of the waiting pots and covered them with a 1/4 inch of straight humus. They looked fine. 5 weeks later, plants broke the surface, not the full dozen I had planted, but 7 at least. When they developed to a height of about 2 inches, I got ready for the painful necessity of pulling out all the weaker ones so the remaining plant would have free reign of the pot without having to fight for it. I tried to lift out the plants with my trusty old nail file and transfer them to new pots as gently as I could. A few survived the journey, but most of the plants lasted only a couple of days in their new quarters. The papaya roots was registering their objection to being relocated without taking the whole pot of homestead dirt with them. This was still only the beginning of my papaya problems. One day I woke up to find that every last one of the surviving plants had toppled over. Even a mature papaya root structure is fairly weak, and plants frequently tip over in tropical winds. But mine weren't tall enough to be affected by any winds, not to mention the fact that although our apartment sees many strange visitors, including the perennial New York burglar, as yet we haven't been hosts to a hurricane. Poring over the plants, I noticed that close to ground level their stems were a little pinched and drawn looking. I propped them with toothpicks, but my worst fears were confirmed the next day. The pinching was even more pronounced. No doubt about it, they were infected with damping off, the bane of every plantation manager. As a fungus thriving in moist atmosphere, it is always a particularly painful topic to the growers of jungle crops. I have ransacked libraries, garden centers, and hospitals for a cure to damping off, all without success. There are some chemicals on the market which claim to retard its growth, but this particular class of fungi, though microscopic in size, spreads so quickly the only real remedy is to dispose of the plant lock, stock, and pot. Saving the soil for new plant is like sticking a child with measles in a hospital ward because there's no room for him anywhere else. When it's really putting its best foot forward, the fungus can spread and infect a plant sitting next door to the originally diseased one in less than a day. While it normally does not attack mature plants, it will lie in wait with everlasting patience for the next batch of seedlings to come along. Having disposed of the contaminated papaya pots, I started all over again. This time using the moist cheesecloth lined container method. There was a remarkable variation in germination time. Those seeds sprouting about 75% of the total took anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks. As soon as a few cracked open and pale tap roots stretched out, I transferred them to a pot poked full of holes about a quarter-inch deep with a pencil. This batch fared better, but now I had new problems. The grown papaya likes sunshine. Its seedlings do not. I learned this lesson the hard way. Until the plants are 3 inches tall or so, they should have no more than about an hour of direct sunlight a day. After that, the more the merrier, provided the soil is kept moist but not wet. Having another batch of papaya seedlings destroyed, this time apparently by too much sun, I began to wonder gloomily how many more unknown problems lay ahead and how many of the fruits we would end up eating before I got a good papaya patch going. I decided I'd better check into other possible uses of the fruit besides simple consumption. That's when I found out I'd not only been devouring papayas in various forms all my life, but I'd probably been brushing my teeth with them as well. The most widespread use of the papaya is not in the form of the fruit itself, though in the tropics it is one of the most common and universal fruits, often equated with the cantaloupe of the north, but consumed in far greater quantities. In the temperate zones, its use is equally common, if unobservable, to the average consumer in the form of papain, the dried, purified latex of the papaya. People of the tropics for centuries have wrapped their meat in papaya leaves, letting them sit overnight to become tender. Modern science cubbyholed the practice as superstition, until it discovered the papain seeping out from the leaves actually did tenderize the meat. Then, presto, a big industry. Today you can buy powdered papain in almost any store under the various brand names for meat tenderizer. But that's only the beginning. It is also used in chewing gum along with chicle, another latex from the sapodilla. I haven't exactly reached the stage where I'll plant gum to get a sapodilla tree, but they are very attractive trees, and I'll think of some way one of these days to get the feel of the brown sugar flavored fruits from which to legitimately extract seeds. If you don't chew chewing gum and don't use meat tenderizer, chances still are you have imbibed papain in some form. Many vegetable juices have papain added to clarify them, and approximately 80% of all the beer brewed in the United States is stabilized and chill-proofed with it. Then there's always toothpaste. Many of the Smile Brighters contain papain, as do some skin creams, lotions, and freckle removers. Medicinally, it is widely used for gastric distress. The industrial uses are just as numerous. Textile manufacturers use it to de-size fabrics. Pocketbook makers, shoe producers, and other leather users tan hides with it. It is also sold as a spot remover. When I narrated this impressive list to Susan, she eyed the full-page newspaper spread of papaya seeds in semi-permanent residence on the kitchen sideboard with new interest, and dryly suggested we might trim the pile down by threading the de-aerialed seeds into necklaces. Party favors for our next guest, she explained hopefully. New gimmick. They could take them home and wear them around while they're germinating. You could call it the living necklace. None of this long list nor Susan's botanically impractical suggestion helped my poor papaya plantation. But my next crop perversely weathered the critical seedling stage with flying colors. By using extra fertilizer, letting them have plenty of sun now that they were beyond the seedling state, and being extra careful not to overwater them, I was sure I could maintain a respectable papaya patch after all. They were growing much more slowly than I had expected, but I shrugged it off as the price one pays for being an apartment dweller. I was more right than I knew. Their stunted rate of growth became more painfully obvious with the passing months. Often a papaya would stop growing entirely, its new leaves remaining small and whole rather than palmatifying, that is, dividing themselves into the proper indented shapes. Then, about a month later, having lost its more mature leaves, the plant would give up the ghost. There seemed to be no conceivable cause for this. The soil was sterilized and not moist enough to produce root rot. There were goodly quantities of light and fertilizer. In desperation, I finally contacted the University of Hawaii College of Tropical Agriculture. They were sure to know what was wrong. Dr. Ivan W. Budenhagen, chairman of their Department of Plant Pathology, solved my problem, or rather defined it as insolvable. Papayas are very sensitive to ethylene, a common constituent of automobile exhaust and industrial waste. I suspect, he wrote, that your air in New York is sufficiently impure so that air pollution products may be your problem. So, in all likelihood, my poor papayas were being polluted to death. And while friends of mine, living apart from the industrial heartlands, could raise their papayas to almost unmanageable sizes in proportion to their rooms, I would have to be content with my diminutive ones. Not only that, but every time I step out into the street in the morning and am greeted by lungfuls of chewable air, I wonder if my anemic papayas are trying to tell me something. The one thing I discovered that did seem to lift their spirits a little was keeping the humidity high. Susan was valiantly struggling to clean the window of at least a layer or two of New York soot one day, and I was making sympathetic and grateful noises since, left alone for even a month between the window cleaner's visits, the windows acquire an opaque look not conducive to the best plant growth. Suddenly I realized she was washing the windows with an absolutely indispensable gardening tool. It was a spray bottle, a non-aerosol, push with your finger type, and she was just standing there placidly spraying it at the window. I kept my eye on it till she was finished and watched which shelves it resided on. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, I took the bottle and discreetly emptied its contents into a jar. I rinsed it out well with hot water. Voila, a jungle mister. Using warm, almost hot water, the water temperature is reduced sharply by evaporation as it leaves the spray bottle nozzle. I bathed my jungle with a mild mist. The papayas seem to take to it happily, and I've made it a daily habit with them. But early in the morning, so the sun doesn't hit the plants directly until the water has evaporated. If the sun shines directly on leaves laden with water droplets, the leaves tend to turn yellow or brown. I do my merry finger exercise quite often now. Spraying with an occasional morning mist is good for almost all tropical plants. Sometimes I give them an evening dew too when I feel particularly frustrated. It makes a pretty good tension releaser if you can keep a sense of humor about it. Of course, one can get a little too frustrated sometimes. After one particularly harrowing day, I came home and headed straight for the jungle. 4 bottles of mist later, I felt a soft tap on my shoulder. Turning, I found Susan dressed in her rain slicker. Somewhat plaintively she remarked, "But it never rains in other apartments."